Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, we're going to look at the Dyson Logos Bundle of Holding. Monte Cook Games is having a 50% off sale for the 50th anniversary of D&D. Wizards of the Coast has published lots of D&D 2024 class videos. We're going to take a look at those and particularly ask ourselves, what does this mean for DMs? It's a big question for me. By the end of this year, we're going to have 4 different kinds of 5th edition. Major publishers have put out 4 different kinds of 5th edition. We're going to take a look at those different versions of 5e and say what makes them different from one another. Why would we pick one over the other? We're going to look at all of those. I'm going to talk specifically about Doom points in Tales of the Valiant, an interesting feature that Tales of the Valiant monsters have. And we're going to cover more questions from the June 2024 Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons get access to a bunch of tools, tips, tricks, supplements to help them run their games. You get access to the awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord and the Patreon Q&A, and you help me put on shows like this and help support the work that I do. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your outstanding support. I am such a huge fan of Dyson logos and Dyson logo maps. I absolutely adore them. I use them in all of my games. I've used them for science fantasy games. I've used them for numerous RPGs, like of different kinds of RPGs, everything from Dungeons and Dragons, traditional Dungeons and Dragons, to Shadow Dark, to all kinds of stuff. I just love them. I find them an extremely valuable lazy DM tool. And Dyson Logos now has a Dyson's Delves bundle of holding going on. This is a fantastic deal to get access to all of the different Dyson Delves bundles that he makes available on DriveThruRPG. Again, Dyson, with like bundles of holding, you have sort of different layers that you can jump into. You can jump into the starter Delves, where you get a whole bunch of initial sets for $10. But if you pay the threshold, which I think is currently at 20, what is the threshold at? The current threshold is at $22.51, so just under $23, gives you access to everything, including huge cartography collections and commercial available map packs. 200 commercially available maps, all available in PDFs and in separate files that you can pick up all at once. I highly recommend it if you want to support Dyson Logos. Dyson is a tremendous value in our industry, tremendous supporter of our hobby here, with so many maps that they have available up on the Dyson Logos map website, but also giving away a tremendous number of maps, hundreds of maps available under a commercial license. I have used the commercial license myself to build things like the Dyson, my Dyson map selector. I have a very quick sort of JavaScript-based Dyson maps selector where you can size them and look and find a map that works for you. It generates them randomly, so you can just hit reload until you find one you like. I was able to put this together because Dyson releases his maps under a commercial available license. So please check out the Dyson's Delves bundle of holding. Fantastic deal, great way. My feeling is, like, you pay $24 for this. You put all of these in a directory, and I'm pretty sure you have maps to run you the rest of your life. You probably don't ever need any more maps. You can always find more maps, and of course there are maps to everything, but you would, generally speaking, never need another map. There's lots of tools these days that help you build your own maps or even auto-generate maps. None of those are nearly as good as somebody who is clearly an expert in map design, not just like drawing them, but understanding what makes a good dungeon layout, understanding what makes them interesting. That whole idea of a compelling design for dungeons. Dyson understands this, and every one of the maps has that kind of concept in it. So way better to have a huge selection of maps that are drawn by a human being who is excellent than it is to try to auto-generate maps or anything like that. That's my feeling on it. And I don't think there's any better deal than spending $23 to get a huge collection of Dyson's maps that you can store locally, keep forever, and use to run games for the rest of your life. So please check out the Dyson Delves bundle of holding. Monte Cook Games is having a sale on all of their 5th edition products for the 50th anniversary of D&D. Monte Cook, who runs Monte Cook Games, was a big designer in the 3rd edition days of D&D, clearly loves D&D. Clearly the people that work on Monte Cook Games love D&D and have written many different 5e. The way the sale works is the more stuff you buy, the better discount. You get up to about 50%. 2 products in particular that I recommend are the Tolus book, with this probably the largest city source book you will ever get, something they had been working on since the early 3E days. Really, really cool product. I've reviewed it, or I've done a spotlight of it on previous episodes of the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I just think it's outstanding. It's like this massive, massive, really cool city source book with a bunch of adventures and a bunch of stuff. And it's pricey. The hardcover, if you want to get it, the PDF and the hardcover version of it for 5th edition is $167. So it is not cheap, right? This is like a Beetle and Grimm level kind of product that you're getting with the physical version and the PDF version of it. But you will get a heavy discount because that's very close. I think is it $250? Let's see, what are the details? If you spend more than $200, you get 50% off. So if you can hit $200, you get $200 worth of stuff for $100. Pretty good deal. The other product I recommend is Planebreaker. I think Planebreaker is very, very cool. It is sort of the Monte Cook Games take on the multiverse, take on Sigil and that kind of work. Really, really cool book with all kinds of different worlds that you can explore, all different kinds of worlds that you can bring into your game, different ways of exploring. I really, really like it. My only complaint is I didn't feel like the 5th edition design was up to what I wanted the 5th edition design to be. That's a minor point. The main reason to be getting this book is because of all of the story and the lore and the artwork and the game design of all of these different worlds, how they operate, the meteor that's kind of the Planebreaker itself, this meteor that's sort of hammering through these different planes, but has like cities sitting on its back. Really, really cool stuff. There is a free preview, so if you want to take a look at it before you pick it up, you can do that. And if you get the Path of the Planebreaker 5e in print and PDF and add that onto your Tolus purchase, you have hit the $200 threshold, in which case you will get them. I think I added both of those to my cart, and when I looked at checking out, it was like $114. And I think it was like $8 shipping. It was actually a very reasonable shipping price, given the weight of these books. Like, you're going to get these big, massive books. So if you're looking to add some big physical artifacts from Monte Cook Games, you haven't picked them up before, now is a great time. If you want to add some Numenera to your 5e games, you can get things like Beneath the Monolith, which sort of adds Numenera-like ideas into your 5th edition game. You don't really need it if you have Numenera, because you can just basically reskin your Numenera books, but that's not bad. So lots of different things, but probably the two big ones that I recommend. There's lots and lots of different 5e products that they're selling. They're selling all kinds of different things that are part of this, including a bunch of adventures. But I would definitely, the two that I would probably recommend are the two that are right at the top of the top of it, which is the Tolus 5e book and the Planebreaker book. Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is still on sale. It is only on sale for a few days more. It is going to be ending early next week. You can get Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master for 30% off the hardcover price or 50% off the PDF. It is only $4 to buy the PDF. Maybe you're watching the show and you're like, hey, Mike, I love your stuff and I've already bought the book. That's great. This is an opportunity for you to pick up the book for friends, to pick up the book for other GMs. If you know somebody that's just getting started, now is a good time to say, hey, I'll go and pick up a copy. If you're buying the digital one, you can just have it mailed to you and then send it to them. There are also ways that you can get an email address to them, or you can let us know through support@slyflourish.com, and we can get the copy that you're picking up sent to your friends so that they can get it too. Or you can pick up the hardcover book. You can put in their address and have it mailed to them, or have it mailed to you, and then you hand it to them with a little signature in the front telling them how much you want them to enjoy this wonderful hobby we have. 30% off the hardcover and PDF, 50% off the ePub. Fantastic deal. Great way to get it. And that's my sale for Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, available on the Sly Flourish bookstore. Links for that are in the show notes below. If you're not familiar with Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, there is a free preview, 11-page free preview of Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master that talks about what this book is about, shows you a table of contents for what kind of topics you can find in this book, description of the way of the Lazy Dungeon Master, why we do this, and of course, the Lazy Dungeon Master checklist, the 8 steps for Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master that I use every week for every game that I'm running, and have reviewed and worked with other GMs. I've interviewed hundreds of GMs, and I surveyed thousands of GMs to come up with a lot of the concepts that are inside of this book. It is my best-selling book. It's probably the book that I am most known for. If you don't have a copy, now is a fantastic time to get a copy. Check out the Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master sale. So this week began, continued. I think last week they had started, and then this week they had continued. Wizards of the Coast has been releasing short videos, like 30-minute-ish videos, describing all of the changes that they've had for all of the classes in the 2024 D&D core books. And so we've had a kind of fun viewing sessions over on the Sly Flourish Discord server. Again, patrons of Sly Flourish have access to the Sly Flourish Discord server. And one of our fine members, Bram, has been running a viewing party where people can view it. It's kind of in the middle of the day. It kind of happens at noon, so I'm usually not able to attend, but other people are able to jump in and kind of watch and talk about the different things that they have. And I come to this with a very slanted view, a very specific point of view. I don't really pay a lot of attention to what new cool things characters get. I always pay attention to what makes the game easier or harder for GMs to run. We had this discussion on the board, and I don't know, I'm going to make this statement. I'm going to make a strong statement that I hold loosely. I don't think there's anything more important than making sure that the game is easy to run for a GM. I know that that is not a hard rule. It's not like if it makes it slightly harder for a GM, then you should get rid of the most fun thing that a player has ever had. So there's obviously ranges on this, but my feeling is that there should, whenever you're making a book like this, and I wished and I hoped that they had this, and I feel like they probably all think that they have this in mind, it would have been nice, or feels like it would have been nice for them to have a GM advocate that is sitting in the room whose sole job is not to ask whether or not a feature is cool, or whether players are going to like it, or whether it helps balance out character classes, or whatever. They should be the GM advocate whose sole job is to say, is that making it easier for a GM to run the game or harder for the GM to run the game? Or does it really not have an effect? There are times where it doesn't have an effect. There are times where you can make changes and it really doesn't have an effect. And there are definitely times where there are things that you can change on the player side that are both beneficial to players and to GMs. This is not a one or the other. This isn't an us versus them. An example of that is changing the summoning spells to summon single modifiable stat blocks instead of having it summon 8 wolves helps everybody. And the reason why is players love to have characters that can summon 8 wolves that you can micromanage and control and knock prone and run around the battlefield. You know what they don't like? When their friend is doing it at the table, because then they're sitting around on their phone playing Marvel Snap while the other person gets 9 turns. No, that doesn't help anybody. It's not even a GM problem. GM tends to be the one that has to deal with that situation. But players want their time in the spotlight too. And if you give one player, one character, an effect that lets them take a 10-minute turn because they get to control 9 different turns worth of monsters, every other player is not enjoying that time. So there are definitely times, and that is an example of a change that is occurring, I'm pretty sure, in the 2024 Player's Handbook, is that the summon spells for being able to summon woodland beings doesn't summon 8 creatures. It instead summons a stat block that scales with you and changes into a woodland thing, and that you run. So I'm bringing this up because as I'm watching these videos, and some more than others, I ask myself, did they ever ask themselves what that's going to do for the GM? One that really stood out to me was early on with weapon masteries and the Maul. And most of the weapon masteries are yeah, those are all cool. They have all the weapons have a little effect that does another thing. Okay, that's fine. The Maul, however, their effect is knockdown. Well, knockdown, everyone's well, knockdown's not a big deal. You knock somebody down, they stand back up again, right? I get knocked down, I stand up again. Nobody's going to knock me down, except unless you can't stand up because you got knocked down right after the end of your turn, and now you're prone for a whole round, and everybody in melee gets advantage on all attacks. It is one of those effects that scales significantly. Prone is not a big deal at first level, and is a much bigger deal at 17th level, when fighters can get 8 attacks a turn. And they can go over and knock someone prone and then get 8 attacks with advantage against this prone target. Here's the trick. And this is one of those things where you're did we learn from this? The Monk, I think, is coming up on Monday. They're going to do a video about the Monk. And I'm almost certain that the Monk's Stunning Strike ability is going to be turned into a one-time per turn ability, the same way that the Paladin Smite was turned to a one-time per turn ability. Being able to smite multiple times a turn, meant that the Paladin could spike a tremendous amount of damage. But it wasn't really a problem for a DM. Because we can always have more monsters, we can always have more hit points. It doesn't really affect us that much. Stunning Strike does. Stunning Strike and being able to do multiple Stunning Strikes a turn is a problem because you can use them against legendary monsters and burn all of their legendary resistances down while they're trying to resist Stunning Strike, and you're doing 3 of them a turn. Also, it allows a monk to move around and stun multiple targets at once by going and hitting one, doing one save, another one, hitting another save, another one, hitting another save. And if you're hitting the right people and you do well on your saving throws and stuff like that, then suddenly you've stunned a bunch of creatures. It really felt like the 2014 Monk Stunning Strike should have just had the words once per turn after it. Then it makes perfect sense, but it didn't. And then for 10 years, we've had monks that are running around doing Stunning Strikes, burning down legendary resistances and everything else. Okay, but they look like they're changing that. I'm highly confident that they are going to be changing Stunning Strike to be 1 time per turn, the same way the Paladin Smite is 1 time per turn. But guess what isn't 1 time per turn? Knocking prone with a maul. And now it's not even just one character class. It's anybody who has a mastery in the maul can knock people prone. And you're like, again, being knocked prone is not the same as stunning. It's not, but it's pretty bad. And I've heard all the arguments that, but if they're knocked prone, they're actually a disadvantage on range attacks. I know, I understand. But trust me, a well-optimized group that wants to use that can do it. And as far as I know, and I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, boy, then I'm wrong. I think the maul knockdown is on every possible attack, and it doesn't use any resources. It's not like a Battlemaster maneuver where you only have so many points that you can spend on it. You can do it on every attack, which means a level 11 fighter can do it 6 times in 1 turn because of action surge. They can go prone, 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 prone. They can go around and knock a whole bunch of people prone, or they can just find one dude and hit him and try to knock him prone until eventually he's prone. They also have saving throws, which means you're rolling more dice. Right? So there's this, you have to hit them, and when you hit, you have to make them have a save. All of that takes time. And that's one where like the GM advocate would be like, is this going to speed up battles or is this going to slow down battles? And do we feel like up front, the design, I know I'm picking on this one thing, one little maul strike, right? But the question is the battle going to get slower or faster when we have new things that stack on top of other existing attacks that don't require an action to do? They don't use up your bonus action to set them up. And now you both are rolling an attack roll and doing a saving throw. And instead of being able to roll all your attacks at once, you have to roll each one because you don't know if it's going to hit. And if it hits, they have to roll a saving throw. I don't think there's any way you can look at this and say, yeah, that's slowing the game down. And guess what? 4th edition slowed the game down so much that everybody complained, right? 4th edition, not everybody. I'm sure there's 3 people out there like, I ran 4th edition battles in 10 minutes. I ran a 20th level 4th edition fight and it took me 80 seconds. I can tell you, having played a lot of 4th edition games and talked to a lot of 4th edition DMs, battles took like an hour to an hour and a half. And 5th edition battles can sometimes take an hour and a half. I ran one that was 3 hours long recently, and that was designed to run 3 hours long. It was a great big fight. I'm not complaining about that. But we shouldn't pretend like 5th edition battles are fast now. And I don't think we should look at this stuff and say, and guess what? This is going to make it faster. It feels, I don't know, I haven't run it. It feels like it's going to be slower. That's one thing. Then rogues, for example, now have a new ability that they can use their sneak attack dice to add new status effects onto their backstabs. They can backstab and not just backstab and do damage, but do backstabs like poisoning the other target. Again, inflicting a saving throw. It's not quite as bad because rogues aren't going to be doing it 6 times a turn, but it's still like a new status effect based thing. Are we putting more status effects? It's not like we're taking status effects away from the characters that used to do lots of status effects. No, we're giving more status effects to all these guys that typically didn't do status effects, which means now we're piling on more status effects. And that's going to make battles more complicated. It's going to make them longer. It's going to be harder for DMs to tune battles to make sure that when the story makes sense, that we threaten it, all that kind of stuff. You know who else says that's the case? Wizards of the Coast. Here was a quote that they posted on the D&D Beyond site. This is one of those where I read this and I was really mad, right? I was kind of insulted. And I was like, what the hell are you even doing? The fact that you said this makes me upset, right? These are the devious strikes. Now, granted, level 14, and at level 14, things are already gone. So I've only had a couple of campaigns that reach level 14 anyway. So I'm not getting really upset about the specific ability, but I am upset about this statement. Daze, who says a support build can also deal damage? If your target fails a constitution saving throw, they'll only get to move or take an action or bonus action on their next turn. Frustrating for dungeon masters, but fantastic for your party. Are you kidding me? Like, I saw that and I'm like, who are you making this game for? Why would I run this? If you're telling me, we built things in here that are designed to be frustrating for dungeon masters, or we knew it was frustrating for dungeon masters, but we went ahead anyway, you're not advocating for DMs. And I don't think, maybe you figured out some new way that players can play without a DM, but why would I do that? I'm just go downstairs and play Destiny 2. Why do I need to run a game that's specifically designed to be frustrating for dungeon masters, right? That I know, like, they didn't sit down and go, let's make an ability that DMs hate, but they know better than this. And this one's not even that big a deal, right? So I understand it, but they said the quiet part out loud. And you're like, okay, but Mike, that's just one guy who wrote an article on D&D Beyond. It's not like the whole design team got together and said, hey, let's frustrate DMs, until Jeremy Crawford said it the next day. And then we have a cartoon. Right? I was like, you know what this game is going to turn into? It's going to turn into a fighter with a golf bag full of different weapons so they could decide which one of the many dozen of status effects they're going to apply to it. You know who else thinks that? The cartoonist over at D&D Beyond, who said like, I think now how to deal with this type of trap. Hand me the toppler, right? And it's got like a wizard with a golf bag full of golf clubs to decide which one they're going to use in order to hit it. Is this the kind of game we want? It's not the kind of game I want. Not really. So one of the other things they had in a video was they were talking about warlocks, and they were specifically talking about the Fey warlock, who's going to have all kinds of zany teleportation things, which aren't so bad. But then they also, this is Jeremy Crawford was talking about it, talked about how the warlock is going to have a way, particularly the Fey warlock is going to have a way to both hit a creature and make that creature want to attack them and having disadvantage on attacking anybody else. But they will also be invisible to that creature, which means that creature is at disadvantage on everybody. And Jeremy Crawford referred to this as like, monsters are going to hate this. And I'm like, when you say monsters are going to hate it, who do you actually mean? Because monsters don't hate anybody. They're not real. The monster is a stat block sitting on a page. But somebody's running that monster. And this is where you get into like video game mentality. When I play a game like Baldur's Gate 3, or I play a game like Elden Ring, or I play a game like Destiny 2, a bunch of different games that I played, when I find some cheesy way to beat a boss in Elden Ring, or I figure out an optimized set of guns and powers in Destiny 2 that makes me particularly effective, nobody gets particularly upset on the other side. Sometimes the designers will look and be like, yeah, that didn't go the way we wanted to, and we're going to go change that a little bit so that you can't just completely ace this whole game. We want you to keep playing. But generally speaking, there isn't someone on the other side who's getting upset every time you do it. That's not true with D&D. There's a human being on the other side of those monsters, and the human being wants to see monsters behaving and having the abilities and the effects that we expect the story to support. And that can't happen if they're like, oh, they're at disadvantage the whole time. It feels like they know this. Right? 3 instances in the last week alone. 1, frustrating for dungeon masters, but fantastic for your party. 2, hey, which one of these different golf clubs am I going to use to knock down this monster? 3, monsters are going to hate when they're at disadvantage to attack the warlock, but also they're at disadvantage to attack anybody that isn't the warlock. Those are all instances where it feels like a DM advocate could be like, what do DMs feel about this? Right? Is that what we want? And who should we be considering? Because we're the one that runs the game. Also, how many of the player handbooks do you think are going to be bought by DMs? You know, a lot. The real customer of most of D&D's products are dungeon masters. Even the player's handbooks are going to be bought by dungeon masters. I know, like, oh, but they haven't even talked about the monster manual, and they haven't even talked about the dungeon master's guide. There's nothing you're going to be able to put in the dungeon master's guide that's going to speed up combat when you put this stuff in it. Nothing's going to make it quicker. Right? Nothing's going to make us deal with this kind of stuff. There really isn't anything that they can put. Better advice, great. But like, you know, they didn't give better advice to players. They gave players a whole bunch of new toys. What new toys are the GM getting? Do I want new toys? Not really, because my job is to make the game run smooth and fast and give everybody good spotlight time so that they can show off their abilities. And I can't do that if every character has 37 different things that they do on their turn, and everyone else is sitting around waiting for them to figure out which one of the 7 different new rogue powers they can do. Oh, which one of my multiple weapons have the exact right maneuver so that I can then use my new rogue ability that also doesn't take an action to figure out exactly how to poison the creature so that I can force a saving throw on it. Oh, headache. I could be totally wrong about all of this. It could be totally awesome. I was wrong about things in the past. I was like, advantage is a terrible thing. Rolling advantage on a check is such a crazy high bonus that it's going to break the whole game. Everyone's going to be critting all the time. It's going to be nuts. Like, advantage is a terrible, terrible idea. I was wrong. It turned out advantage was really, really cool. Advantage has now been ported over to a lot of other games. It's a really good mechanic. So I was wrong about this. And I could be wrong about this too. It could turn out that all of the things that they smooth out with 2024, which I don't think are insignificant, are going to make the game more fun for everybody, and that for a GM, it'll be fun to run too. I was like on board until I read this. This is the thing that really set me off. Frustrating for dungeon masters. If this were any other game, I'd be like, yeah, I'm not even reading anything else. I'm not going to look at anything else you're doing. I'm done. Right? If you ever tell me that something is in the game that's going to be frustrating for dungeon masters, I don't know who you're aiming it for. Because I'm the one that runs the games. I'm the one that sets them up. I'm the one that schedules them. I'm the one that's make sure we have a place to go. I've spent probably 100 to 1,000 times more money on the game than many of my players have. Now, I actually have lots of players who are DMs themselves. They've certainly got a big investment in this. Oh, man. This brings us to the other one, though. Because I'll tell you, one of my snarky remarks was, every time I'm watching a new D&D 2024 class video, Tales of the Valiant looks better and better. Tales of the Valiant had a reputation early on when Tales came out, when Black Flag came out, the Black Flag system reference document, and Tales of the Valiant came out. A big common perception was you really didn't change a whole lot, right? Like this game came out, but I don't know why I would play this over D&D because it's really pretty much the same thing. There's subtle refinements, but it's the same thing. But now that we're seeing the kind of, in my opinion, I'm going to say some words here that you might disagree with, gonzo level new abilities that they're adding to everybody in 2024 D&D, maybe a refinement of 2014 is exactly what I want. Maybe something that's like, well, yeah, we definitely want to split out heritages and cultures. We definitely want a different way of looking at ability scores. We want to kind of clean things up a bit. We want to sort of refine things and making sure martial classes have more interesting things. It looks like Tales of the Valiant did a better job of focusing on what made 2014 good without expanding it out. Now, I'm saying this, I just got my physical copies of the books. They look beautiful, by the way. Really, really gorgeous books. And I haven't run it yet. I haven't run Tales of the Valiant. So maybe I'm imprinting my own desires on it more than it actually is. Because Tales of the Valiant does do some things that 2024 D&D does. Like you get a starting talent. Now you don't get a lot, and talent is their equivalent of a feat. So you're getting a feat early on, just like 2024 D&D does. And the feats that you pick up later in Tales of the Valiant, you also get an ability score increase the same way 2024 does it. So it still has a steeper power curve for characters. They acknowledge this. Celeste Conowitch acknowledged this in her articles where she was talking about the design behind it, that, you know, it does increase character power, that characters inside Tales of the Valiant are going to be more powerful than your typical 2014 character. But they're not adding all of this other stuff that I'm beginning to see. And that and it really looks like the 2024 characters are going to be, you know, I don't know. They look a lot beefier than the original ones do. Then it's like, well, maybe the one that I want to run is the one that's a bit of a refinement from 2014 D&D, instead of being basically like, we're just going to stack double the amount of new abilities on every character. So when we think about all of these and we're looking at all of these, this year, 2024, we're going to have 4 different 5e player handbooks from 3 different major publishers. There's actually more than that. There are other companies that have come out with other player handbooks for their particular style and their RPG as well. But I'm going to focus on 4. And those 4 are the 2014 D&D books that we've had for the last 10 years. The 2024 books, which are coming out in September. Tales of the Valiant, which has just been released. And Level Up Advanced 5e, which was actually released a couple of years ago. All of them are major 5e variants. They're all focused on 5e fantasy. So I'm not including science fiction variants like Esper Genesis, which is also a full-fledged 5e variant, but it's based on science fiction. But looking at those 4, then the question is, okay, so we have these 4 different ones. What are the differences between them? And which ones would we want to choose for the one that we're going to run with our friends at the game? This is a work in progress. I've only played 2 of the 4, really. So I really only understand 2. And one of those, I've only really played just a little bit. So I'm really haven't gotten a full feeling for like Level Up Advanced 5e and what it's like. But I'm trying to get this idea of like, how can we look at these different versions of 5e and understand what they're doing and figure out which ones work best for us. 2014 D&D, it's the original one. It's been around for 10 years. It's got millions and millions of players. It's probably, I'm making up a number, but it feels like there's 20 million player handbooks out there, right? There's tons of material for 2014 D&D out there. It was significantly extended through Xanathars and Tashas, so a lot of the things got kind of cleaned up in Xanathars and Tashas. Some stuff got added that I wasn't really happy about, but generally speaking, when you add Xanathars and Tashas, you have a lot. It's fully compatible with basically every 5e compatible product that's been released in the last 10 years, right? You can run monsters, you can run spells, you can run subclasses, you can run magic items, you can, all different things that people have been publishing for 5th edition are compatible with the 2014 version of D&D. We all know it. And in fact, anybody that's been playing like Baldur's Gate knows it as well. I know Baldur's Gate isn't exactly 2014 D&D, but it's close enough. Like, it's very experienced. It's very well supported. D&D Beyond has character building. There are free rules, basic rules, and system reference documents, and there's extensive digital tools to run 5e games from various vendors. So there's lots and lots of support for the 2014 version of D&D. So that's kind of the baseline, right? Then the other ones are what differs from that one in different regards. Tales of the Valiant. This is by Kobold Press. This was put out. It just got fully released now. Has been under development for the last year or so. I would argue that this is the closest modern 5e variant to the original 2014 5e SRD. That it refined, and this is both good and bad, because there are things I wish they had changed that they did not. But then they changed a lot of things that that I think were good. But they generally didn't stray too far from what the original 2014 version of D&D had. It splits up race into lineage and heritage, 8 lineages, and 14 heritages. Also has backgrounds as well. Ability scores and bonuses are all done together. This to me is a huge advantage. In fact, I like this so much. I think this is something that you can port over to any version of the game. Instead of bothering to have ability bonuses tied to backgrounds or tied to other things, just separate ability bonuses out and give a standard array. One thing I love in Tales of the Valiant is as a very specific standard array, you apply it, you don't add any modifiers, and you're done. Super, super simple. It's like 2 sentences long. It's really, really good. They have talents instead of feats, and talents are the equivalent of a feat and a half because they include a +1 ability score increase, or known as an ASI, to their talents, which means their feats are beefier than typical feats. They have 2 subclasses per class, so not as many subclasses as I think any of the other ones have. But the subclasses are pretty meaty. Like, you're not going to be It does include a new class in it, which is the Mechanist class, which is kind of their version of an artificer. So if you're looking for one that's got sort of an artificery-like class, then you've got that in there. Magic items have costs in the player's handbook, so they actually have a way to determine like whether you could buy that or whether you could craft them. It's got crafting rules for it. It has a luck system. I fell in love with the luck system the minute I read it, and I've ported it over to every other game that I've been running, including Level Up Advanced 5e. Which is a much easier system than Inspiration has been previously. The idea behind the luck system is every time you miss a attack or a saving throw, you get a luck point. You can expend 3 luck points in order to get advantage on your next attack or next roll, or you can spend 1 to get a +1 bonus on that. There's little tricky bits like whether that means you kind of need to know what target number you're shooting for if you want to know if you want to spend luck points on it. So that's something to work about. It has an idea called the Doom Pool for monsters, which is almost like luck points for monsters. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because I think this is something that we can port over to other systems. It could be really useful, particularly when your monsters are getting knocked prone 6 times in a turn. The spells are mostly from the 2014 D&D and were not changed very much. And this is probably my biggest problem. I think I would be 100% in love with Tales of the Valiant if they went through and fixed some of the known problematic spells. For example, they did not change the summon spells so that you can't summon 8 wolves. You can still summon 8 wolves. They did not fix things like Hero's Feast still makes you immune to poison, which discounts tons and tons of monsters who depend upon their poison damage to be effective at all. And if everybody in the party is immune to poison, you've basically completely, like, you could take on every ancient green dragon in the world by being immune to poison. There were little spell-like things I wish they had spent more time on. Level Up Advanced 5e did spend the time and change those spells up, recognizing the difficulty that they can impose when they're at the table. I wish more time had been spent on that in Tales of the Valiant. It does have character builders available. There's one available right now on Shard. I built a character using it yesterday. It's a little tricky. It's not quite as D&D Beyond friendly, and the printer output is not quite as clean as a normal character sheet, but it does work. You can build a character, and it will do the math for you. It has virtual tabletop support for Roll20 and Foundry, and they are expanding to other VTTs in the future, is what I hear. So that's kind of where Tales of the Valiant stands. I'm just giving like an overall view of it. I'm not doing like a spotlight on it. Someday I'm going to dive in even deeper and probably take a look at it as well. I want to know that everybody can basically buy the book and get it before I do that. Level Up Advanced 5e. It's been around for 2 years. Very well refined. This is done by EN World Publishing. I am now running this for my Wednesday group. We're second level, so we're only in the earlier days of it. They too split up heritage and culture. All of the new ones have done this, like split up heritage and culture. Unfortunately, they are using different names they're using the same term to mean different things than Tales of the Valiant does, which is kind of annoying. They've renamed some core classes. Paladins are heralds, monks are adepts, barbarians are berserkers. That kind of rubs people the wrong way. It's like, really? Was paladin a problem? Did we really have to rename paladin to herald? They have reasons why they did it, but one question is like, did they need to? You'll have to judge whether they needed to. The big thing that Level Up Advanced 5e added, I'd say the number one biggest thing that it has that's different than everybody else, is this idea called combat maneuvers. Combat maneuvers are essentially like a spell-like system for martial classes, and there are literally over 300 different combat maneuvers. Now, you don't select all from one of the 300. They are refined down to being tier-based and focused on particular schools, so different classes will have access to particular schools. So generally you're picking like, just like spells, you're kind of saying like, okay, between which domains I can cast and what type of spells I can cast and what level the spells are, those are the spells that I can select from. So that you can knock it down to a reasonable amount, but it's a lot of material. And it's a lot of material I look at and go, I bet you there are some humdingers in there that are going to make my life as a GM harder. I'm worried about that. And so far I haven't seen any, but I'm like, I don't know. Like, we're going to worry about that. It has a warlord style class. So if you're into the 4th edition style and you love the warlord, it has a class called the marshal. We have a marshal in our group. One of the players is playing a marshal. Backgrounds contain ability bonuses. I house ruled this and just did it the same way Tales of Valiant did. 95 different feats, and they are normally powered feats. You do not get an ability score increase and a feat. You only get the feat. So these are equivalent to what the 2014 version of feats were like. It has a very big emphasis and system on travel and exploration with an idea of supply, that you carry so much supply, you expend supply when you are resting, you need to have supply handy. It's another resource that the characters manage, and something else that the DM can use to kind of control things. If you remember Baldur's Gate 3, the video game, had this where like you have to have so much supply in order to take a rest. And, I don't know if you're like me, in my Baldur's Gate 3 game, it didn't matter. I had so much supply. I could eat apples all day long. All classes are given options for exploration and roleplay scenes. I think this is true with the other ones too. They wanted to make sure people like barbarian. What can a barbarian do when you're at a ball, right? When you're at a rich person's ball, what can they do there? All of the classes have things that you can do while you're exploring and while you're in roleplay scene. 3 to 5 subclasses per class. Magic items are in the Trials and Treasure book that include costs and ways to craft them. Skills are fully abstracted from abilities, which I really like. I'll talk about this more once I dive into it. But the idea that you don't really worry about which ability score is tied to what skill. It's actually an optional, not even an optional rule. It's kind of the way it is in D&D, but nobody plays it that way, is that you can use different ability bonuses for different skills depending on different circumstances. That's baked into Level Up Advanced 5e. You have skill specializations and expertise dice. The better you get at a particular skill, you can add a die to it. The better you are, the higher the die. Spells were rebalanced. They went through a lot of spells and cleaned up a lot of them. Not everyone is perfect, but they're very good. And I think that they have done a better job of rebalancing spells in Level Up Advanced 5e than Tales of the Valiant did. And they're limited. This is a big problem. There is a limited amount of digital character builders. The only one that I have found that I've used is a really good Google spreadsheet for building Level Up Advanced 5e characters. My group have been using paper and pencil to do it. I know that some of them would prefer to have a digital system, and I had to quickly build a character for a friend of mine that was coming over to play, and I used the Google Docs, and it was significantly harder to build a working character than it would have been if I whipped one up in a tool like D&D Beyond. So I kind of wish there was tools like that. I've already been talking about D&D 2024, so I'm not going to dive too much into this. You just heard my giant rant about D&D 24. But obviously, it is a fully revised version of D&D from 2014, from the creators of the original 2014 version. It was built on being built on dozens of playtests with thousands of playtesters. They split up species and origin instead of race. You get feats at first level. You get other feats, include an ability bump, which means they account for a feat and a half. Ability score improvements are built into backgrounds. There are 4 subclasses per class in the book. The whole new weapon mastery system, kind of equivalent to the combat maneuver system in Level Up Advanced 5e. Only weapon masteries you have all the time. As long as you're dealing a weapon and you have a specialization in that weapon, you can do it. Updated and rebalanced spells. We haven't really heard everything about them, so we don't know how they were updated and rebalanced, but it certainly looked like in the playtest that they were doing some good work in there. Tons of additional class features. That's the big one. Like, they just stacked on a bunch of different class features, so you have to decide if that's what you want. Loosely compatible with all previous 5e material. What do I mean by loosely? If you watched my show last week, I talked about what I mean by loosely compatible. I think there are parts of 5e material that are going to be directly compatible. You can just drop them right in. Other things I think might be a little trickier. You might have to do some house ruling. You might have to figure out how that stuff works. I think by and large, you're going to be able to bring stuff in. Little things like drinking potions as a bonus action, that's easily ported over. And obviously, there's going to be tons of digital support for 2024 D&D, including D&D Beyond, Roll20, Foundry, and Fantasy Grounds have all said that they're going to have D&D 2024 in it. So those are kind of the way to look at these 4 different systems. And I think like as we get more experience with them, we'll begin to understand why we might like one system over another. Right now, for me, Level Up Advanced 5e is the top of the list. And the reason why is I really like how they have the focus on exploration. I like how they rebalance spells. What am I worried about? The 300 combat maneuver thing means there's a lot in there that could be game breaking. There's a lot of stuff in there that could make my life harder. I don't know how you playtest 300 combat maneuvers when it's so hard to playtest 300 spells. So that combat maneuver thing is the thing that I'm going to be looking at. And the limited digital support is a problem. I really wish they did have a cleaner character builder. I wish Shard supported it. I wish we saw something on Roll20 where I could do an easy character in it, but they really don't have the support. They've been working on getting a digital character builder for a long time, but we haven't really seen anything. And we're going to have to see what D&D 2024 does to the mix. But I think the idea that like everybody expects that everyone's going to default to D&D 2024, you don't have to. I don't have to. We get to make a choice about which one we're going to use. And I think the one point that I would like to make with all of this is we get to look at all of these systems, generally pick the one that we think closest fits to the kind of game we want to run, and then we can steal stuff from all the others. And that's what I plan to do. So I'm curious, what do you plan to do? You can let me know in the comments. In Tales of the Valiant, in the Monster Vault in particular, they have a feature for monsters called Doom Points. And I think Doom Points are an interesting idea. And I'm wondering whether or not they can be expanded. Doom Points, very, very simple, like just a few paragraphs in this book, and it's considered an optional rule. At the start of each combat encounter, a GM gains a special resource called Doom based on the CR of the encounter. I assume that's the total CR, like you add all the monsters together, and that's how many Doom Points you get. It wasn't exactly clear what the CR of an encounter meant. As detailed in the Doom by Encounter tier table. The DM can use Doom to influence the results of creature die rolls, turning the tide on the PCs or helping a creature last just one more turn longer. The GM can spend Doom in the following ways. Give a creature advantage on an attack roll. Give a PC disadvantage on a save. Once per encounter, refresh, recharge, or otherwise gain one additional use of a limited use feature such as a Dragon's Breath weapon, a legendary creature's legendary resistance, or a spell in the mage's spellcasting. Doom is optional and exists to give creatures some extra staying power against particularly powerful, crafty, or resourceful PCs. Keep in mind, Doom doesn't have to be used in every combat encounter. As a GM, consider using Doom in an encounter if the combat encounter is likely the only combat encounter the PCs will face all day and the PCs are well rested. You have multiple experienced players. You have more than 4 players. Your players' characters have extra magic items, resources, optimized statistics, or similar aspects that make them tougher than the average PCs. If the encounter is particularly significant to the story, such as a fight against a leader of an antagonistic organization working against the PCs, the final fight of a major story arc, or a climactic fight against a powerful antagonist. And the amount of Doom you get is like CR 1 to 4 is 1, 5 to 8 is 2, 9 to 12 is 3, 13 to 16 is 4, 17 to 20 is 5, and 21 plus is 6. I think this is an interesting idea. And when one of the reasons I think about it, and I think that we could actually take this idea and port this over to whatever version of 5e that we're running, is let's be blunt. I can't trust any version of 5e to help me as a GM maintain the story of a boss monster. I talk about this, Scott Gray and Teo Sabadia and myself talk about this pretty at length in Forge of Foes. In my opinion, boss monsters are at a distinct disadvantage just for being a boss monster. The minute you make one monster stand up above the rest, the characters will focus every ounce of their wrath on that monster. They'll pour everything on them. They'll take every save or suck spell. They'll run everything they can do to make sure that guy does not ever get to act or dies right away. And what's funny is this is really a good example of that concept that's been going around from the days of Civilization. I don't know if it was Civilization that did it, that players will optimize their way out of the fun. And I think that that is a powerful thing to consider, because if players manage to get their characters to destroy every boss in a campaign without that boss ever acting, they wouldn't probably like that very much. And yet that's what they want to do, right? That's their initial drive is, I want to charm that boss. Like, it's really fun to charm a boss monster once, and now the boss is on your side fighting against all of his own guys. That's really wild. It's really fun to throw a force cage. One of my favorite boss encounters was when the characters threw a force cage on that boss, and the boss managed to negotiate his way into sticking his tentacles into their eyes and ears, even though willingly, right? That the offer he made was so good, characters gave up their mental capacity to this mind flayer, like it was actually an aboleth. I have circumstances where those sort of opportunities for a character to really get an edge on a boss was an interesting part of the fight, but not all of them. And many times bosses are just going to get destroyed. And the story, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, why do I get upset by this? Like, why not just let them destroy the boss? And I think it's because the mechanics are getting in the way of the story. That characters have abilities whose mechanical effect breaks away from the story about this boss. There should be just some bosses that you can't just immediately blind and they never get a single attack, or that you can't just throw in a force cage and they're stuck for the entire battle and they can't do anything. It actually is, the story of the boss is better than that, right? If you're fighting Lord Soth and you throw a force cage on him and you go up with a glaive and poke him through the bars with a glaive until he's dead, That would suck. I don't think you can really do that I think you could do that with a force gauge because he can't teleport. So he's stuck in there forever. He never got a saving throw because force gauge doesn't allow a save. That feels like it would suck. Now, what feels true to the story of that boss is you throw a force gauge around Lord Soth and he grimaces and says something dark. And then he grabs the force gauge and he rips it open. And then the players are like, you can't rip open a force gauge. It's like, he can. And that's what I'm wondering if Doom points are good for. What if Doom points, what if we expand them beyond these three things? Getting advantage on an attack roll, forcing disadvantage on a save, or recharging effects or recharging other abilities. What if they were a sort of get out of jail free card for a boss? What if we could kind of improvise a bunch of different ways that these things could be used? For example, what if they could penetrate resistances? What if they could say, yeah, you've got your crazy, like, if I take half damage, if I get hit by an area effect, I only take half the damage. And if I make a save, I make none. And you say, actually, no, he pierces through that ability, right? Or, ripping through a force gauge is another example. Breaking past, penetrating Hero's Feast. The ancient green dragon's breath is so powerful that with this next one, he forces such energy that it blows past your Hero's Feast and you take half the damage instead of no damage, right? That it can pierce through stuff. What if Doom points could do this? Now, a lot of people are going to like, that's terrible, Mike. What you're talking about is terrible. That's cheating. You're forcing the story of the game. You're breaking past all the stuff in there. And that's why we'd have to be really careful with it. And we could be careful in a couple ways. One is there's a limit on them, right? You only have so many Doom points. I don't know if I would do this. I might say like just for ease that a boss has 3 Doom points. So I don't have to worry about the CR. I would certainly tell the players about them before they even face a boss who's going to use them. An example would be I could tell my characters, I did this on Wednesday, and at first I got a lot of resistance. And then when I told them what if it was limited, they were like, oh, actually, that's not so bad. And if I said, look, there are certain creatures in the City of Arches who are blessed by the Nameless King. These blessed creatures get advantages that other monsters don't. They typically cannot be charmed, knocked prone, put asleep, stunned, they pinned down, stuck in a force cage, all of the things that you might normally do to control a creature, these guys are not going to be controlled because they are blessed by the Nameless King. And then if I said, and each of them has 3 blessings that they can use, where they can call upon their energy tied to the Nameless King for aid in this, and it's typically going to break through crowd control-y sort of stuff. It might also be used to burst through things like resistance and whatnot. That would be a potential option. Yeah, somebody brings up counterspell. Guess what? When you have a creature that's blessed by the Nameless King and you try to counterspell them, they can use one of their abilities to break through your counterspell. Their spell is going to have an effect. And the intention with these things is to give an element of the story back to the boss so that they actually act like the boss would be expected to act like in a story. Because we're using mechanics that break past the story when we try to pin them down. If Indiana Jones had no trouble with any enemy he ever fought, we all love the scene where he pulls out the gun and shoots the swordsman. That was really funny. Guess what? Temple of Doom, he faces off 2 guys. He reaches for a gun. He doesn't have it, right? And the reason why is if you do it all the time, now it's boring. You do it more than once and it's boring. So what are the things that you can do to offset that? And I'm wondering if Doom points are a way to do that. I wonder if Doom points are an option that we can give to very particular boss. Not every monster gets it, not every fight, not even every boss fight. But in boss fights where you recognize that certain bosses are going to need advantages like this, can we give them a resource that they can spend to do things you normally can't do? Like, I'm going to breathe out and all of your saves are at disadvantage because I'm using one of these coins, right? That would be a way. I actually want to use coins for it. I think I've got 3 little campaign coins and I want to set them out and those are the coins and he would use these and bang, he would have these options to inflict things that you normally couldn't do. So I'm working on this. This is a concept. This is not yet fully tested, fully run, fully endorsed. It absolutely works. I haven't really tried this yet, but I want to try it. And I'm thinking I'm going to try it. One nice thing about this idea is we don't have to try it everywhere. It doesn't have to be the new thing. We can just try it for one fight and see how it does. And maybe we don't even need it, right? Maybe it turns out that the boss did fine without him. But maybe we can try them. The one thing I would do, though, is I would make sure it's clear to your players what you're doing so that it doesn't look like you're just cheating on your side. And you're like, yeah, you have rules. I don't have any rules. Like, no, I have rules. They are these 3 things, but these 3 things are used for these particular purposes. And that you explain it to them. And you're like, I'm not going to stop you from doing damage to the monster. I'm not going to stop you from being able to defend the monster. But I'm using them when the story of the monster is not meeting up with its actual play at the table. And that's what these things are for. They are to give an advantage to a creature that needs it because of the role that they have in the story that we're telling. So that's my thought about Doom points. I like the idea here. I'm not sure they actually go far enough. The idea that they can restore a legendary action is good, but I don't think they can do other things that we might want them to do. I want to play with this idea, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. So go ahead and feel free to leave me a comment. Every month on the Sly Flourish Patreon, we have the Patreon Q&A. Patrons are able to ask any question, any RPG-related question they want. Some of those questions come here to the talk show where I dive in further. I answer all of the questions on Patreon every Friday morning. Some of those questions make it here to the talk show where we dive in a little deeper and kind of spread the knowledge of what we've got going on. Nathan says, I'm going to be running a small campaign July through September for a summer, I think he says summer scheme, but I think it's like summer camp, for a summer camp which focuses on children and teenagers with varying levels of autism. I've been running games for adults for 3+ years, but I've never done anything for young adults or early teens. Can I be cheeky and technically ask 2 questions? 1, any general advice on things to change to avoid for running with younger players? And 2, more specifically, have you any experience running games for players who are neurodivergent? And is there anything you've found to help with engagement of these things, to help with the flow of the game? Honestly, I'd appreciate any input from anyone on the Discord, as I want to make this as fun an experience as possible for them. So yes, first, I would definitely hang out in the Sly Flourish Discord server and ask people then, particularly about young players, because I don't really have a lot of good advice. I've heard advice that I will pass along. I don't really run RPGs for young people. I've done it on occasion. I've done it a handful of times, very, very few amounts of times. Obviously, keeping the action heavy, like making sure that they are doing things as often as possible, maybe even picking systems where they are faster and they get through turns quicker and they aren't super complicated could help. So I don't know that like 5e D&D would be okay, but you might do something like Shadowdark if they're willing to have the super danger of Shadowdark. I've been thinking a lot about Shadowdark as a good starter set for D&D, a good way to understand what D&D is like, because I think it's much easier to understand Shadowdark. But it could be dangerous too. And it could be dangerous because you're going to kill characters all the time. And maybe that's not what kids want. Think about what system you're running would definitely be something, and in keeping the action focused. But on the idea of neurodivergence, this is one where I do have experience, at least with one player. I had one player that I played with for a long time who was definitely on the autistic spectrum. And I can tell you what kind of happened there. The one thing I would say, and I've heard this too, is you cannot expect that neurodivergency is just neurodivergency and it operates the same way for everybody. It operates very differently for everybody that's involved. And so trying to figure out what are the best ways to work with each individual is going to be pretty critical. What's their thing? How does it work? Like what ways do they engage with the game that are perfectly fine, you don't need to do anything with? What ways could be disruptive that you need to work with? You're going to have to figure that out for each one. For my friend Brian, who I played with for a long time, for example, we knew that he had trouble getting feedback of his behavior. And this clearly had been a problem for him for his whole life, that he would be doing things and it would affect, it would affect people around him, but he didn't know that it was affecting around him. His way of dealing with this was to continually ask people if he had done anything wrong. And he would say, like, did I do something wrong? And that actually pushed people back. And they're like, why would you ask me that? Like, no, you didn't do anything. I haven't been paying attention to you at all. But he would sometimes turn to people and say, did I do something wrong? And I had to explain to people that were coming into the group. We all figured it out. And I explained to new people that were coming in. We have this friend named Brian. He's autistic. And his thing is he's going to ask you if he did anything wrong. You won't have any idea why he's asking that question. The answer is no. Just say, nope, you're doing fine. And if you say that, he goes right back into it and everything goes smooth. And I remember I had a player who was coming in and I explained that to them. And then it happened and she said, nope, you're doing fine. And then went back in. And later she's like, wow, that was so helpful. Right? Because she's like, they really put me off, or it didn't put me off, but it put me on edge. Because I was like, what, did I do something wrong? Like, did I give you the impression that you had done something wrong? Because it really threw people off. He couldn't see, unfortunately, he has passed away. He couldn't see when he had a behavior that was wrong. And he did have some. And we would just tell him, right? We would say, Brian, please don't do X. And he'd go, okay. Right. But he didn't have the ability to kind of see when he was affecting people until it was too late. And he'd been kicked out of a bunch of other D&D groups. So it was important for us to understand what that one thing was for him and then figure out what the way was to operate with that, which was when he asks you that, it's not because he thought you had saw something wrong. It's just that's his ping. He's pinging you to check. And the answer is no, you're doing great, right? Unless, I would say unless he was doing something wrong, but if he was doing something wrong, you should have told him even before then, right? So it was a tricky thing to deal with, and it takes effort. Like one thing is like this took effort. Our whole group, it took effort for our group. We still had a wonderful time. He was a wonderful player. We share many stories. Again, I mentioned that he had passed away suddenly, and it was very sad for all of us. And we still talk about the different adventures that we went on with him. He was a really outstanding player. A lot of terrible things happened to his characters that he was a very good sport about, and we miss him. And it was. It did take effort to kind of get the game to work around his behaviors and the mannerisms and everything else. We still had a really good time, but that took energy on all of our parts. So I think those are just some experiences that I wanted to share since you asked that question, and since I did have some experience with that. Christy M says, can you outline the pros and cons of running the 2 types of monster stat blocks for 5e? So we're talking about monsters. We're talking specifically about spellcasting monsters. I'm going to show 3 different examples of spellcasting monsters, all exactly the same kind of monster, which is the mage. So we have the 2014 mage. The original mage is what we might call like a spell slot mage. And if you look at this stat block, this is the original one, now 10 years old, and you can see like the mage stat block, all of its power, it's a CR6 creature, but all of its power is packed up in spells. If you look at its dagger, it has actions, dagger, +5 to hit, 4 damage. Obviously, a mage that is stabbing with a dagger is not hitting at a CR6 level. And instead, the expectation is with the spells it has, that's what it's got. And the spells include Counterspell, Fireball, Fly, Greater Invisibility, Ice Storm, Cone of Cold, and stuff like that. So really, its spellcasting ability, its challenge rating is coming from the fact that it casts Cone of Cold. Now, in D&D Beyond, of course, you can just click Cone of Cold or highlight Cone of Cold, and you get a description of Cone of Cold. That's really nice. But if you've got the book in front of you, you have to go look up Cone of Cold in a whole other book to understand exactly what it does. I actually know what it does, but a lot of people don't. So I think 8d8. See, I even have to look. I think it's 8d8 damage, right? And a cone. Yeah, 8d8 cold damage and a cone. So I'm pretty close. But in order to run this one, you had to go get another book to run it. So more recently, Wizards of the Coast had started to change how they were doing mages. If you look at Monsters of the Multiverse and how it does it, it's different than how the other one did it. Now we have 2 other monster books out from 2 different other publishers that I'm going to look at. One example is the Level Up 5e mage. This is from the Monstrous Menagerie, and it actually is sort of a hybrid of the new way and the old way. It still has its power packed up in spells, but it lists the spell here and tells you what it does. So for example, the Cone of Cold is listed here, right? As an action, one of the actions it can take is Frost Blast from the mage in a 60-foot cone. Each creature in the area makes a DC 14 con check, so it already has the DC in there, taking 36 damage. So this stat block, but you can tell it's also pretty big. Like it's a pretty big meaty stat block, but it operates the same way that spell slots operated. So at least with the Monstrous Menagerie version of the monster, you have the main spells, not all of them. The main spells that monster is likely to use in battle are described in the stat block. But then the newer way is like what Tales of the Valiant does. And Tales of the Valiant says, we're going to make custom abilities for this monster that are treated kind of like spells and operate kind of like spells, but aren't really spells. And the example you have here is this is the mage multi-attack. Remember the dagger that was doing 4 damage? Well, this one doesn't do 4 damage, right? The mage makes 3 dagger or arcane bolt attacks. It can replace one with the use of spellcasting. So dagger attack, it does 2 piercing damage, d4, plus 13 force damage. So it can hit you 3 times with a dagger, doing 15 damage each time, 45 points of damage. That meets the CR6 amount of damage with just daggers. By the way, it can also throw them. They're like arcane daggers kind of, but it actually has arcane bolt. Arcane bolt is a force damage range attack, 60 feet, does 16 damage, force damage, and it can do 3 of those. Those are kind of like really big magic missiles. But again, that hits the stat block the certain way that it has. But then it still has some other ones, including Fireball, Haste, Slow, Great Cone of Cold, and these other ones. But the main thing is if you want this monster to operate at a challenge rating 6 level, you don't need to use those spells. You can just use the dagger and arcane bolt attacks. Now, if you wanted to do an area of attack like Cone of Cold, you still have it there. You'd still have to look it up. So it's really up to you which monster stat block you like the best. I think a lot of people kind of like the Monstrous Menagerie version of it still casts spells the same way a monster casts, that Spellcaster casts spells, but we've got descriptions about what they do inside of the stat block. I do really like the simplified stat blocks that I'm seeing in Tales of the Valiant, for example. And I also expect that's the way the 2024 Monster Manual is going to go. That we're going to have spells like Arcane Bolt, where he can throw 3 bolts out. You don't have to worry about, figuring out what the spell is. They're still doing 16 damage to 3 different targets, or 40 whatever damage, 48 damage to 1 target by hitting it with 3 arcane bolts. The advantages, going back to the question, what are the types of advantages, the pros and cons? The pros are, for the newer style, it's much easier and faster to make sure that a monster is hitting at its challenge rating without having to worry about looking up spells. They're just treated like other abilities on a monster stat block. The disadvantage is they might not feel like a normal spellcaster. And some players are like, why does that mage get Arcane Bolt? How do I get Arcane Bolt? Like, you don't get Arcane Bolt. You get all kinds of other stuff. I think it's safe, and I've had other conversations with brilliant friends of mine who are like, yeah, I think monster spellcasters should behave like character spellcasters, and the idea that they don't is a problem. For the example of like the master rogue gets 3 attacks a turn, but the rogue player character only ever gets 1. How do you manage that? So there's some, you have to decide whether or not having monsters behave very differently than characters is a problem. The other big question that often comes up is, can you counterspell things like Arcane Bolt? It's up to you. If you want to have them be able to counter Arcane Bolt, particularly because Arcane Bolt doesn't really, it's not really a spell. It's not really going to affect the monster other than stop them from being able to do that. You can do that. Or you could argue like, no, these are actually a monster ability, not a spell. They don't go through. Or you could do what I do and just say, how about we don't counterspell? I hate counterspell. I won't counterspell you if you don't counterspell me. Christy, I hope that helps a little bit. I kind of like the new style, but take a look at the monsters from Level Up Advanced 5e. You're a patron, which is why you have a question here. So take a look at the different kinds of monsters that you can find in the artisanal monster database to sort of see which ones you think work well for you. Blake says, I wanted to ask you about how to ask for details from players without giving things away. Sometimes I find myself asking clarifying questions about things that players do, and I feel like I'm doing so give things away. For example, let's say there's a small pond, easy to walk around, but might be a little annoying to a character to take extra steps to walk around it. On the other side is a pond and a cabin. The players say, I walk to the cabin. I feel like I say, well, do you walk around the pond or do you walk through the pond? The players all of a sudden understand there's something in the pond, so I shouldn't go there. Am I reading too much into this, or is there something I can do to get answers to my questions without giving away the potential surprise? Very good question. Very hard problem. I don't really have a fantastic answer for you. I dealt with this very thing just 2 weeks ago in my Shadow Dark game, where I thought it was pretty clear that an item would be heavily protected, but one of the players say, well, I go up and I grab that thing, and I said, your character's disintegrated. And some of the players were like, you gave no warning at all that thing was that was a problem. And my argument was, if I had given away any warning, you would have not done it. You would have immediately said, oh, what was I doing? And maybe that's correct, but I feel like I did give a lot of warnings because there was a very similar item in another room where you saw that a bunch of people got disintegrated trying to take it. I feel like you had the warning to not just go up and grab items that are sitting around. But there's that question of like, how much you say. If I say like, are you sure? Their answer is, no, I'm not. I changed my mind. I don't want to grab the thing. Or I want to make a bunch of checks and figure it out. Or I'm going to poke it with a 10-foot pole. Or whatever you're going to do. When you ask questions, you're going to, their antennae are going to go up, and they're going to be a lot more suspicious about the things you ask questions about. When you say to them, you're walking down a hall, please show me every square that you walk into with your little miniature on the thing. They're going, oh, never mind. I'm going to poke at stuff. This is really hard. And the problem is, if you ask for that level of detail all the time so that you're not giving things away like traps or whatever, then the game is going to be slow to a crawl. It becomes very antagonistic. It becomes a real problem. I don't have a good one. I would probably say, don't do what I did. And I would lean more towards the players and certainly recognize that the characters are better at what they do than the players are. The players aren't explorers who are going through deadly tombs and that's their life. The characters, their life is going through deadly tombs. They're probably a little smarter. That's why things like passive perception can work really well. And it's really hard not to give things away. So this is the problem you're having here is a common problem. I don't have an outstanding answer on how you can ask for clarifying questions. Just you got to think about it. But also, if you ask a question and that helps them be more suspicious, then maybe that's fine. Because I think I heard Justin Alexander gave a good impression. He said like traps should be detected by the characters 9 out of 10 times. It's far more fun to detect a thing than it is to get it sprung upon you. So if we accidentally give them too much information and let them detect a thing, we're still leaning more towards the fun of the game than we are if they get spring. And we might be kind of amused when they spring a trap. And sometimes they might spring a trap anyway, or spring, when by trap I mean anything, including like a sea monster coming out of a pond. They might do it anyway, but I think it's still more fun when they know that they're doing so than it is if they feel like they got snookered into it. So I would lean more towards the players. I would go ahead and ask the clarifying questions, even if they give things away. I think you're probably in a better state. Peter H. says, several times you've spoken about having a few standby players for your campaigns who can fill in when regular players can't make it. I'm hoping to get for something like that myself. A few practical questions. For instance, do the standbys use their own characters or characters from the missing regulars? If their own, do you let the standby players level up together with the regulars to keep them group balanced? Do standbys feel part of the campaign? And if not, can that have problems? Any other practical tips? So to answer all those questions, I've talked about this in a few other shows too. So you can do searching through the talk show database if you want to learn more. But A, they have their own character. Yes, they don't use a character from another player. I don't think I'd ever want to do that. I know some people do that. I don't know why you'd want to have multiple players sharing a character. Just have a new character. So they have their own character. The character does level up with everybody else. So if everyone else is level 7, they're level 7. They get the same benchmark as everybody else. Don't make it hard for them to come into the game. Make it easy for them to come into the game. Let them come in at the same level as everybody else. And to make them feel part of the game, they can have part of the story of the game connected with their character too. You just don't want it so tight that if they're not there, it can't happen. There are definitely, you can still have them well integrated in the story. And the way you do it is by having a loose grip on that, not having things super tight around what's going on in the game world and their character. But when their character comes in, review that character, understand what their background is, and improvise ways to kind of connect their character to the story for that particular section, recognizing they might not be there next week. They may not have been there the previous week. That's why kind of building to improvise, giving yourself the tools to improvise, abstracting secrets and clues from their sources are good ways to drop a secret and clue that their character knows when you didn't even know the character was going to be there. So little tricks like that to keep them in there. But yeah, let them bring their own character and let them use their own character. Have the characters level up with everybody else, and then use things like secrets and clues and other abstract information to draw their character into what's going on in the game for the game that they're there. Malicious Codes 36 says, I was watching your rankings of the adventures you've run for 2014 5e, and it led me to do some research on your website, and I found your article titled Reading Published Adventures from 19 February 2018. I really enjoyed this article because I often hear you talk about what work you have to do to make a campaign work for you, and it makes me wonder what your process is and how you evaluate an adventure and find the problematic areas. Would you consider doing a video or maybe a series of videos of this evaluation process when selecting your next adventure or campaign? I think new DMs like myself might find great value in such an exercise. Yeah, so the article he's referring to is called Evaluating Published Adventure. No. So I have a few different articles in this: using published adventures, reading published adventures, and how to customize published adventures. But one thing is like, I've been thinking more about this question. I wrote an answer to it, but I've been thinking more about it. And one of the things is like, what I start by is reading the overall adventure plot and outline. How is this thing supposed to run? What is the storyline that is going on here? And do I see anything that sort of gets my hackles up when I'm looking at that? What I found is that it's easier to look at an adventure and then find something up front that's not going to work for you than it is if you read it and it's going to work for you and then you run it and it doesn't. The minute you find something that doesn't work well for you, you can then decide, is this worth working through, or should I just not run this? And hopefully you find that sooner than later. But an example is, the minute I read Vecna Eve of Ruin, I knew that I didn't want to run it because I didn't like the way the plot operated. So that was very easy. It was done. But when I ran Tomb of Annihilation, I didn't know what the problems were with Tomb of Annihilation until I was well into it. I knew some of the problems up front, but probably one of the biggest problems, which is the deadly shift of what the game is like when you're in the tomb versus all of the time you've spent outside of the tomb, was something I wasn't aware of until I ran it. Now, I still love Tomb of Annihilation, so I still would have run it anyway. I would have liked to have known that before I ran it. There are other times where like Rime of the Frost Maiden, where I read it and there were lots of things I didn't like about it. And the things I didn't like were actually still true. But then I found other things I didn't like about it after I ran it. The same was probably the case with Descent into Avernus, where I didn't like the introduction to Descent into Avernus at all. I still ran it. I managed to get around it mostly because excellent producers like Justice Armand and Anthony Joyce wrote a thing that fixed the whole intro that I didn't like, but then I found other things that I didn't like later. Sometimes the things that you're going to find, you're not going to find until you're into it, versus adventures when you read it ahead of time. But ideally, what I look at is how is this adventure supposed to operate? And is the plot of the adventure something that excites me and is interesting and I feel it can work? And then there's some big questions that I have, like how brittle does this adventure feel? Can it fall apart based on one decision or one discovery? If they learn a thing, would it change everything? Or is the adventure pretty free-flowing and you know that it can still work regardless of how things work? How much agency do the characters have to change the adventure? Do they have a fair bit of room in there to make choices about where they're going to go, what they're going to do, who they're going to meet, and how they're going to accomplish things? Or are they just riding a ride at an amusement park where every choice is made for them? They're going from point A to point B to point C. How easily can I change things up if I need to or if I want to? And can I change things up just because I feel like it or if I want to customize things? Is it pretty easy to do so, or no, really, you got to follow what's going on in here? And what parts of the adventure do I think I'm going to have to change, and how hard are they going to change? Or how much do I just feel like I might want to change it for my own good? Those are some of the questions that I ask when I'm looking at it. And I try to get that up front by reading the adventure summary, just understanding how this connection goes. Like if you pick up Storm King's Thunder and you just look at it a little bit, you're going to recognize that this is a huge, wide-spanning adventure where the characters could travel up to 2,000 miles in order to accomplish relatively small tasks. Is that going to be a problem for you? Is the idea that the structure of Storm King's Thunder isn't super tight and that you're going to have to bring some of that structure with it? You're probably going to be able to figure that out up front. One thing is, like, I really don't think that reviews do adventures justice. When Vecna Eve of Ruin came out, there was one critical thing in that adventure that made me absolutely not want to run it. I knew it wouldn't work for my group. I knew I had no interest in running it. And I didn't see any reviewer who brought it up. Like all of the sort of major press reviewers that I read, nobody brought it up. And I don't know if they brought it up, didn't want to bring it up because they didn't want to spoil the adventure. But I'm like, if I'm going to be the GM, you should spoil it for me. And I didn't have information. And that kind of that bothered me because I was like, a lot of people are going to buy this and they're not going to know what the plot hinges on. And I know what the plot, I was lucky. I got to read the D&D Beyond version before I bought the physical book. And it was enough that I called the game shop and said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to pick up the physical book because I'm never going to run this. And so I don't think we can trust reviews of it. I think you can probably trust forums more than reviews. I don't think mainstream reviewers have any better look at what an adventure is going to run like. In fact, it may be worse because they're influenced by the fact that they got a freebie. They know they have to write an article. They're probably getting paid to write the article, even if they're getting paid by somebody else, right? I don't think Wizards is paying them. But, you know, they're staff writers that are writing articles for this. That doesn't mean they have any concept of what it's actually going to be like to run this adventure. Where when you look at message forums that talk about it, EN World has forums, Reddit has forums, Discord servers where people are talking about it. Get a lot of views from a lot of different people who read it and say like, hey, these are some things that we're going to know. Go to spoiler forums where they're going to tell you exactly what's happening, because that's a much better way to understand what the issues are going to be with an adventure than like a glossy review that they said like, oh, I had to write it really quickly. Of course, I didn't have time to write it or to run it, but I wanted to get it out the day the adventure came out so we could get all the press. I just don't think that those reviews really offered anything that is going to help us run these adventures. I look back, I have friends who wrote glowing reviews of adventures and then later came back and said, boy, was I wrong. Like I ran it and ran nothing like I thought it was. You know, you got to really be careful. Like I don't think it hurts you to read a review, but you can't trust that the review is going to be a good idea about whether or not you should buy an adventure or not. So those are some of my thoughts. Bernie says, during combat, I tend to get very confused when reading the monster stat blocks. If I drop a monster that I didn't plan on running in advance, I tend to forget special attacks, traits, etc. What advice do you have for handling stat blocks on the fly? A, give yourself a break. We're all human. I forget stuff all the time. I like to joke about the fact that I've run liches about 12 times. I've never run them right. I've always forgot stuff because liches are super complicated stat blocks. I always forget stuff. One thing to do, though, is look above the action line. So when you're looking at a stat block, let's pull up a stat block. So when you're looking at a stat block, I'm going to pick on the Mezzoloth because this was one that actually I had this sort of ability. I had this sort of observation. You look at its actions and you're like, okay, it makes 2 attacks, Trident, claws, Trident to teleport. It's got some spells. Oh, look, it's got Cloud Kill. Well, I'm not going to class Cloud Kill because it's going to be blind in its own Cloud Kill. And then you have to look up and go, oh, wait a minute, it's got Blind Sight. It can see in its own Cloud Kill. Not only will people be poisoned and dying inside the cloud, but the Mezzoloths inside the cloud are both immune to poison, so they can stay inside it and are fine because it says condition immunity poison. And they have Blind Sight, which means they have advantage on all their attacks. I nearly wiped out a pretty high-level group with a small group of Mezzoloths because they filled the area with Cloud Kills and were poking them with advantage the whole time, and the characters had disadvantage to hit them. It was brutal. It was absolutely brutal. But it is only brutal because you're looking at senses and because you're looking at condition immunities. If you didn't pay attention to that, you might miss the fact that Cloud Kill is as powerful as it is. It's really, really tough. So one tip is read above the action line. Don't just look at the actions and do what the actions are. Look at stuff like its senses are really important. Understanding what the senses are. A creature that has dark vision doesn't really matter, but blind sight absolutely matters. Having immunity to its own effects is another big one. I've heard that liches that sit inside their own Cloud Kills are really, really brutal because everybody that's nearby is getting poisoned, but the lich is totally fine. That's because the lich is immune to poison too. Another one is like if you're improvising a monster. It sounded like in your question that you were dropping a monster in that you weren't prepared to run, which is totally fine and totally happens. Give yourself just a minute or two to read it. Just tell people, give me 1 second. I just want to read through this and do a quick skim read of the stat block. Look at all of the actions. Maybe have a 3x5 card next to you and note down the specific things you want this monster to do. Those would be my 2 big ones. Make sure to read like all of the stats on immunities and conditions and senses, but also give yourself a minute or two to read it and then use a 3x5 card to write some stuff down. And then worst case, improvise some stuff, right? If you feel like the monster didn't get to do the thing that it ought to do, but it's still around, you can go ahead and improvise that it can do something. Maybe it casts Cloud Kill and does a bunch of attacks because you forgot to use the Cloud Kill right up front. Go ahead and add, improvise stuff as you need. Try to make that monster feel interesting based on the story of the monster by improvising abilities if you forgot some. I think it's totally a fine way to go. David says, why are TTRPG book PDFs formatted in the worst possible way for almost any device you might imagine you want to read them on? Oh, this is such a good question. They are formatted that way because they are easy to send to a printer to make a print version of the book. When you open up a PDF like the Monster Vault, this is the Monster Vault PDF from Kobold Press. This is very, very close. Let's get that. This is very, very close to the PDF that they actually send to the printer to make for print. So it's really like a minor export to take it from the format that you're going to send to a printer to the format that you can send out digitally to people. That's one reason why they do them in 8.5 by 11 PDFs most of the time. Another reason they do it is just inertia. Everybody is so used to PDFs. Everybody else's products are all in PDFs. Everyone's used to doing typically 8.5 by 11 PDF formats, even for digital products that are never going to print. They still format them as PDF and they go there. But I am on your side. I actually think PDFs, they're beautiful. And the one device that I've used that makes them nice to read is an iPad Pro. I have an iPad Pro, and when I'm viewing a PDF on an iPad Pro, the size of the screen is pretty much 8.5 by 11. It makes it very easy to read, and it looks really nice because it's super bright and it looks excellent. So the iPad Pro is the only device I've seen that views a PDF in a way that looks really good. Screen on a monitor is not so terrible either. Publishers, I would love you if you would start publishing books in ePub. I do this for nearly every book that I publish. I think there's only 2 out of the 8 books that I've published that aren't available in ePub, where the ePub is included along with the PDF. ePub is an ebook format that looks good on any device. You can view it on huge screens. You can view it on small screens. It scales to the screen. It gives the reader permission to change things like the font size. It's basically like a bundle of HTML pages put together into a reader that you can download and put on a device and read. They are standalone. It is an open format. It works really well with screen readers for people that have accessibility issues. There are so many good reasons to put things out in ePub, but it takes effort, it takes work, and publishers are not used to doing it. It takes me probably about a day to take the PDF output, and usually I have to get like the original styling information and everything and try to convert it into essentially HTML, which I then bundle together into an ePub. There are tools that can help you do this. Calibri is a tool that helps you build ePubs from HTML versions of documents, so you can kind of export from whatever you published in, get it into, try to clean it up in HTML, try to clean it up with the right headings and stuff like that. You're going to have to fix a bunch of stuff because PDF does not export well, and then export it to ePub using something like Calibri. I use a command line tool called Pandoc that can also build ePubs. I've had to go through all of this. I'm lucky that I've been like an HTML and web developer for most of my life, a good chunk of my life. Well, not most of it, but about half my life I've been doing that. So for me, formatting stuff in HTML is really easy, and luckily formatting into HTML is what feeds into ePub, which means my books, Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master is in ePub, Forge of Foes is in ePub, My 4 fantastic adventure books, Ruins of the Grendel Route, Fantastic Adventure, Fantastic Locations, Fantastic Layers, those are all in ePub. An advantage if you put it out in ePub is you can then publish it on the Kindle store on Amazon. So it gives you another avenue to sell the book too. Please consider, if you're a publisher, please think about and consider exporting your products into ePub and including it along with your PDF version so that it's easy to read on other screens. I kept this question in here specifically because I wanted to talk to other publishers. Man, I'd love you to death if you did ePub. One thing I did, I actually have a really weird script that can take a PDF and convert it to ePub automatically. The output is absolutely terrible, but it's just good enough to read. So I actually ran this on the Secret of the Weird Wizard that Rob Schwab has put out, and it dumped out an ePub that I can read on my phone. Now, the problem is there are entire paragraphs missing. There's all kinds of problems with it. It takes, it's just a one-shot conversion. It takes the PDF, converts it to text, takes the text, does some heuristic processing on the text to get rid of some nonsense, and then turns it into ePub. There's no chapter breaks. There's no headings. There are paragraph breaks, so it looks decent. But in many cases, if there were ever like call-out boxes, the call-out boxes are gone or in the wrong place, or the formatting is all weird. So it's certainly not perfect. But I really wish more people would put out their products in ePub because I think we have lots of different devices. I want to read it on everything from a phone to an iPad to a screen. ePub can do all that. PDF does not. Friends, I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me today while we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. If you enjoyed this show, please consider subscribing to the Sly Flourish newsletter. It is the best way to keep track of all of the different things that I'm doing. It's got links to all of my videos and podcasts and other articles that I write. You get a weekly RPG-related article sent to your inbox and a free PDF adventure builder just for signing up. PDFs again. You can also pick up any of my books at the Sly Flourish bookstore. Right now, there is a sale on Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master for 50% off the PDF and ePub. And that one includes the ePub. And the physical book is 30% off. Or you can join the Patreon. Patrons get access to the Patreon Q&A. They get access to the awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord. They get a ton of different tools to help you run your game. And they help me put on shows like this. Patrons, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Get out there and play an RPG.